All right. Good evening.
Hello, hello.
Good to see everybody and looking forward to our time together tonight. We have, I mean, we're obviously on this pathway to freedom, but we're just like busting with what's happening, right?
Yeah.
So, and someone's like, are you pregnant? Because that's when I say
Oh my
busting,
gosh.
no, that's that. We would not be busting with that. We'd be,
Amy.
yeah. Anyway, so that is not the answer. But however, we are kind of like hard to not talk about stuff. So all we're going to say is this. Massive changes coming up on Think Differently Academy come the end of February or the beginning of March. Mm-hmm. Massive changes. And as I said on my post, you know, we often say it's more important how you know something than what you know. And that's kind of a clue to where we're going. The how we do Think Differently Academy is going to change radically.
Yes.
And everybody will get something important from that.
Yes.
So if you read the post and you're like, how do I get on the email list? It's simple. Go to Think Differently Academy and sign up for a free account, and you'll start getting emails right away.
Right.
In the meantime, there's never been a better time to get a paid account, and you'll understand more as the emails start coming. Yes. Because the big changes, all I can say is it will benefit you significantly.
Yes, you can get grandfathered in.
So tdacad.com.
Yeah, I'll type that in.
I'm Bob. This is Polly.
Good evening.
If you're brand new to this this class or this set of classes, then TD Acad is also probably new to you. It's our website where I know you're finding us on YouTube, but we are Think Differently Academy at tdacad.com.
Yes.
And the home of our resources and soon to be the home of, I can't say
dun,
yet.
dun, dun.
But it's coming.
Yes.
And you'll start getting emails about it as soon as you sign up for a free account. Or if you do the paid account, which is right now $12 a month. Did I just give a clue?
Maybe. That's
anyway.
Okay. That's okay.
All right. So Pathway to Freedom.
You are such teasers. Thanks, Beth. Yes. And just real quick, I just want to say hi. Hello, sign me up. I like this. Danny's watching from balmy Mississippi. And then we have Betty, who's from snowy Borger.
Wow.
And then we're from freezing Texas.
Yes. It's about to get seriously freezing.
Yes. Like crazy and Texas-like. So
right now it's 35, which most people would say is not freezing, except if you're from Texas. We are, however, sitting here by the fire.
Yes.
In our 35-degree weather. There's my Topo Chico. There's half of my face. There's the rest of my face and my lovely wife.
So we're so glad y'all are joining us for our continued series. I think we're on video week 5.
Week 5.
Yeah, on our Pathway series, our Pathway to Freedom series. And remember, there's a little icon down here in the corner if you are not subscribed to our channel, go ahead and click that. And if you feel led to subscribe, that way you can get alerts for when we do live videos. So.
We switched to YouTube to make it easier to share, easier to access. You don't have to be a member of anything. You can come to YouTube. You can share it with somebody without being a member of anything. Anyway, but do subscribe so that you get access to everything. And big changes coming. That's all we're going to say.
And so tonight's going to be a fun class.
Yeah, that will be fun.
Some of my favorite teachings.
Last week and this week are the hinge of everything. Last week, when we talked about the 2 trees, and we'll actually continue that conversation tonight, but it's the hinge and when it really comes to a life of absolute freedom, the concept of what is the problem that Jesus came to solve is the key concept to free your mind and as a result, free your life.
Yes.
So here's how we want to start. When Polly first started seeing clients, we kind of process at the end of the day. And one of the things we firmly believe in is that we are not the engine of change. We really want our clients to know that they're powerful and that they're empowered to bring about change in their lives. And so I taught her to use this question that whenever a client comes in and says, man, everything's changed, or you do some clever intervention or some kind of subtle NLP kind of thing, and they come in the next week, they're like,
things are different.
Man, everything's so different. And you calmly and curiously ask the question, to what do you attribute that change? Because the key thing is, what you don't want to do is, yes, what I did worked. That makes you the expert and them dependents.
Right, and we don't want that.
You don't want either of those things.
Right.
If you're the expert, they need you forever. And if they're dependent, they they need you forever.
Yes.
But more importantly, they can't become themselves if they think you're the necessary component.
Mhm.
So the question, to what do you attribute that change, gets them to kind of look and go, I hadn't thought about that.
Mhm.
Well, we as coaches and counselors, that question is one of the most important questions we keep in mind all the time is, what is it that actually produces change?
Yeah.
When someone is struggling with an eating disorder and they want to be free from that, when someone has a emotional condition like depression, anxiety, those kind of things, and they don't know how to break through, what actually helps with breakthrough, et cetera, et cetera. So when people are looking for change, we ask the question all the time and hopefully answer fairly well.
Mhm.
What is it that produces change in the human soul?
Yeah.
And I'm going to tell you the wrong answer to the question. And I'm going to tell you the wrong answer because it's the most common answer, whether you've thought it or not, when it comes to how people teach and preach the gospel. And I'm going to submit to you that this is a lens through which you should listen.
Listen.
You should listen
Yes,
and
you
listen.
should.
You should listen to all Bible teaching through this lens. And this is the wrong answer. If the engine of change is knowledge and the human will, you've not been given the gospel, you've been given good advice.
Say it again. Say it again.
If the engine of change is knowledge or information and the force or exercise of the human will, you've not been given good news, you've been given good advice.
Ooh.
So good advice, there's a time and a place for good advice. You want to know how to change your dishwasher? Good advice is important. Somebody that wants to be a physician, the med school should give them solid, sound input about what to do and how to do it and where to apply your willpower. But when it comes to the transformation and restoration of the human soul, knowledge and willpower are exactly the thing that makes us sick in the first place.
Hmm.
And that's the switch that we're trying to make, is away from knowledge and willpower. When someone gives you 7 steps and those 7 steps rely on you exercising your will to do each of those 7 steps really well, or to try harder at these 3 steps or 2 steps or whatever, then what you'll discover is knowledge and willpower as the engine of change is not the gospel. It's not what Jesus came to present. It's not what Jesus died, and it's not what Jesus came back to life to make available to us. Knowledge and willpower can happen anywhere in any organization, with or without spiritual power and with or without God. So Jesus didn't come to earth, teach, preach, die, and come back to life so we could do things we could have done without that, right? We'll talk tonight about what is the engine of change, but fundamentally it's important we understand when we assume that information and willpower, knowledge and willpower are the engine of change, that's the root of legalism, and it grows in the soil or grows from the trunk of this tree called the knowledge of good and evil. The knowledge of good and the knowledge of evil are equally destructive. And so the tree that Adam and Eve ate from in the garden, called the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, fundamentally shifted something in their nature. We asked the question both last week and this week, what is the problem Jesus came to solve? And often we think of the answer in a simple phrase, well, Jesus came to solve the problem of sin. And somebody will say, well, didn't he? To which I'll say, we have a lot of conversation to have. First of all, Genesis 3, being the chapter where the problem Jesus came to solve occurred, the word sin is not in that chapter anywhere. But what is in there is a shift in the human soul that takes place when they turn from one tree and turn to the other tree. Now, here's the key thought process in order to get the key concept. I'll probably say this twice too. We have an audience you have to see.
I can't wait.
We are
Lou
not alone.
And Millie, yes.
They are actively engaged in listening, just as you
Yes,
guys
just
are.
as you, yeah.
That's not the key thought process, however. The key concept is the 2 trees and this idea of what is the problem Jesus came to solve, which we will name directly in just a few minutes. But the key thought process is this. When Adam and Eve lived from the breath of life, there was a way that their soul existed, and therefore a way their soul acted or engaged reality. The intake of their senses and the process of their mind was empowered by the breath of life in them. Another way that Paul says this in the book of Corinthians is, he says, we know no man by the flesh, we know him by the Spirit. Adam and Eve knew everything by the Spirit because it was the breath of life to them, in them, and through them that empowered their way of thinking. Right? Leaving the Garden of Eden, they left with a different way of thinking because they turned away from the breath of life or the tree of life, and they turned to this tree called the knowledge of good and evil. The key concept or the key thought process then is to understand this. The problem that Jesus came to solve makes it difficult to understand the problem that Jesus came to solve. I should say that again. The problem that Jesus came to solve changes our lenses about our understanding of the problem Jesus came to solve. So when we think about Genesis 3, the two trees, and when Adam and Eve took the fruit from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, when we think about Genesis 3 with a Genesis 4 mind, then we look back at the events of that chapter, and we think about it with the knowledge of good and evil. Adam and Eve in Genesis 2 could look forward to the future through and by the Spirit and the breath in them. But when the shift came and they moved away from the breath of life and towards the knowledge of good and evil, or rather disconnected from the tree of life and connected to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, their source changed. They changed from the source being life to their source being knowledge. And the dilemma with that is not that knowledge is bad, good, or evil, but that knowledge isn't life, right? And so when we try to get life out of knowledge, what happens is we think more knowledge or more correct knowledge will then get us to this thing that can actually only come from switching back to this tree. Knowing the right thing and exercising willpower is the fruit growing on the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. We left the garden thinking that Genesis 3 was about knowing the right thing and trying hard to do the right thing, knowing the wrong thing and trying hard not to do the wrong thing. And fundamentally, that belief system colors the way we read everything from Genesis 4 all the way through the end of the book of Revelation. So then we think that Jesus came to make bad people good instead of coming to make dead people alive. And we read every single thing that we read through this idea of we have to get this right.
It's through a lens of shame.
Yeah.
It's like everything you look through has shame, not life.
Because that lens makes us measure against each other, against standards that are not life-giving, but rather standards that measure your performance. And always when we measure each other by those external or behavioral standards, shame is the outcome. The knowledge of good and evil, when Adam and Eve took the fruit of that tree, the very next thing is they experienced shame and they began to hide. Sorry, I have to put Millie down. Not in the way that would sound.
I'm sure they understood.
On the ground. Put her on the ground.
Put her on the ground.
She's fine. Anyway, the knowledge of good and evil as a way of thinking fundamentally makes us measure ourselves based on data. Mm-hmm. How did I do yesterday? What standards did I meet? What standards did I not meet? And so we start to answer every single question, read every single verse, measure every single sermon we hear through what steps should I take and how hard should I try?
And why can't I get it right?
Why can't I get it right? The tree of life doesn't measure any of that. The tree of life is about connection to a father. And if any of you are parents and you understand when you want connection with your kids, you don't first ask the question, have you met all the standards for the day? You simply sit down and invite them into your lap. Mm-hmm. And in that connection, you still don't go, now that we're connected, let's find out if you've met the standards. Connection is the goal. When we start to think that the goal is correcting bad behavior, we begin to see everything from all the correction of the prophets through the cross itself about correcting bad behavior instead of about establishing reconnection to a father. I feel like we should read some of these here.
Yeah, there's some. So legalism comes from the knowledge of good and evil. She's like, I'm taking this gem to life group tomorrow.
Absolutely.
And then hard to remember, especially in a world that favors objectives, goals, etc. And then Rose said, this is so hard. Everything we do is about right and wrong.
And everything the human race has done since Genesis 3 has been about right and wrong. And that's the thing Jesus came to set us free from. Jesus came to set us free from a tree that's filled with death and return us to a tree that simply pours out the river of life, water of life, breath of life. Whatever physical metaphor helps you understand that the life of God is transferred into the empty soul of a man. And that's what brings about transformation. Let's say it this way. The wrong engine for change is knowledge and willpower. That's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. The right, or the intended, designed engine for change is surrender, which is an act of the will, but it's not the exercise of willpower. It's the cessation of willpower. It's surrender and then God through us. And as God moves through us, what comes out of us isn't what we produce by effort, but rather what he's been producing all along. And so there is an act of the will involved, but it's not the same thing as what's the right thing, I'll try hard to do it. It's let me cease my activity and learn what it means to surrender to God's movement through me. Now what comes out of me comes from God, and I'm simply a conduit, or as our good friend Beth, it's Beth, right? Beth, don't you teach woodwind? As our good friend Beth would say, we're the instrument that God is playing, and we simply receive and express his breath. And what comes out of us is the kind of instrument that we are. It's a difficult shift because exactly as you said, we're so embedded in the knowledge of good and evil. When Jesus began to present the tree of life to people, and listen to his words, John 1, in him was life, and that life was the light of all men. He says in John 4, I think, and I probably get this wrong, but he says, I should know, but anyway, I came that you might have life and life abundantly. Again and again, you hear that what Jesus presented, the woman at the well, that's John 5, at least I know that. If you'd ask, I'd give you rivers of living water. Again and again, you don't hear him saying, stop this and start this.
Right.
Unless he's talking to the religious people who are trying to keep people from receiving life. What you hear him say to those who are hungry for more is, I came to give you life. And life abundant, and life in this way. And again, you hear him giving life. And so the shift is exactly what Jesus came to give us, away from this idea that the standard comes from us knowing the right thing, doing the right thing, knowing the wrong thing, and avoiding it. And so you have to begin to look at Genesis 3 with Genesis 2 eyes instead of Genesis 4 eyes. I would urge all of you to not just take my word for this, because this is a challenging thought process. In fact, it is a thought process, not just a thought. And that's why it's so challenging. Think about the operating system on a phone, right? If the operating system, everything runs through that operating system, it's all dependent on that. So for instance, if the iPhone people wanted to shut down access to something, for instance, they could simply change their operating system and certain things wouldn't operate on that operating system anymore, right? In the same way, the knowledge of good and evil is an operating system. Our thinking, our motives, our expectations, everything filters through the operating system called the knowledge of good and evil. So you hear a teaching on freedom and it feels wrong because the expectation is, but if you're telling me all I have to do is turn back to the tree of life, what would keep me from doing all the bad things? Because our mindset is that the gospel is about keeping us from doing all the bad things. We don't even recognize how subtle the expectation is that Jesus came to make bad people behave good. It's in the language all around us. I've always said one of my pet peeves is when we present the gospel this way, no matter where you've been, no matter what you've done, right? And the idea with that is, that it's all about how bad you've been, and Jesus can still make you good even when you've been really, really bad. What if it's more about this? That part of you inside that wonders if there's more, that sense that perhaps you're missing something that's intended for you. What if instead it's you feel like you are more than you've been able to experience and wonder why you haven't been able to? What if those questions are just as applicable as no matter where you've been and no matter what you've done? Because the reality is created in the image of God, we've been given all of the attributes that could function as his offspring, as his sons and daughters. But what we're missing is the power.
Mhm.
What we're missing is the breath to us, breath in us, and breath through us. And we're not missing it because God's not willing to give it. We're missing it because we've been convinced that knowledge and willpower is the engine of change. Remember, the engine of change then is surrender and the breath of God moving through us. When that's the engine of change, now what happens is we've changed sources back from the original change in the garden. The change in the bless you. Change in the garden was we moved from the breath of life to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And from that point on, and here's, I told you I'd say it with clarity, the problem that Jesus came to solve is the problem of humans being their own source. When the knowledge of good and evil makes me my own source. Mm-hmm. I must know the right thing. I must recognize the wrong thing so that I'll be strong enough to somehow avoid the wrong and do the right. And in doing that, I've become my own source. Think about this for a second. If you can reach underneath your own feet and pick yourself up off the ground, then you probably don't need the gospel. But if you recognize that because you have no leverage to pick yourself up off the ground and you need something outside of you to have leverage, then you begin to realize the gospel is not so much about you've been doing bad, turn around and go the other way so that you can do good. It's more about, in the garden, we started to become our own source and believe that knowing right and knowing wrong would get us back to God, when actually God wanted to come to us.
Yes.
And wait. And our role then is to wait and receive, not to try and initiate. It's simple, but it's almost too simple. And that's what makes it difficult. Mm-hmm. People think, well, what am I supposed to do then? Nothing?
Surrender is not nothing.
Exactly the phrase that was in my mind. It's like, if you've never tried to surrender, then perhaps you don't understand the thought. What am I supposed to do? Nothing. Surrender is one of the most difficult things for a human soul that's operated under the knowledge of good and evil for decades mm-hmm. to do, because the knowledge of good and evil drives us to try. Surrender drives us to wait. Mm-hmm. Now, waiting isn't passive. Waiting is be still for a minute. When God starts to move with him. When God starts to breathe, inhale. When God starts to speak what he's speaking. But what we want to do is run on ahead and do things for God, when, as we've said a number of different times, we were never designed to live for God. We were designed to live from God. The knowledge of good and evil shifted our source from the breath of God to us. When I'm my source, I try to, by knowledge of good, live for God. When the tree of life is my source, I live from him to the world, and I become that conduit or instrument. Mm-hmm. Let's look at that. So when we look forward and try to read.
So Beth is like, I remember that moment about the woodwind. That was so cool.
I remember that too.
That was amazing. So even good knowledge has no life.
Exactly. Yeah. Good knowledge is important if you're going to build a bridge or do brain surgery. And so good knowledge isn't evil. It's not wrong or bad. It simply can't produce life in the human soul. Mm-hmm. Good knowledge is good to even know principles of interpreting scripture. But principles of interpreting scripture are designed to give us access to God, not steps by which we should do right things.
Because there are multiple people that are so good and so kind in churches. And, even there's good atheists and kind atheists who have great knowledge and all that. And yet they have no life. This life is not there. And so they've connected to the self source instead of the source of life.
Yeah. So let's take a minute. I said Genesis 3 doesn't have the word sin in it. But what I want to talk about for just a second is the idea of sin can be shifted if we look at the events of Genesis 3 through the lenses of a Genesis 2 mind instead of a Genesis 4 mind. In the events of Genesis 3, we shifted sources and fundamentally ended up empty on the inside. I've often said sin is a condition before it's ever a behavior. The condition known as sin would be not the bentness toward evil, but rather it's the absence of life inside the human soul. And when the soul is absent life, we use either our knowledge of good or our knowledge of evil to try to feel alive. So what happens is, if we're climbing up the branch called the knowledge of evil, then we try to find life in things like drugs, sex, and freeform jazz.
Thank you.
But if we're climbing up the branch called the knowledge of good, then we try to fill that emptiness. We try to find life with things like ministry, performance, volunteering at our church. And all of those things, if they don't come from God, are simply our efforts to live for God or our efforts to reach God. As my own source, I am not a spiritual being. I was made to be. But because Genesis 3 is about the emptiness called sin, and listen, I've used this illustration. I know it's not a translation issue, but it's a helpful connection to make. If you speak Spanish or know someone who does, the word sin in Spanish is pronounced sin, and it literally means without. So tonight, if we didn't have any firewood, we would be sin a fire or without a fire. And so it's helpful to think that way, that the word sin, pronounced sin in Spanish, means without, in the same way that sin means we are without the breath of God in us. But it doesn't mean necessarily we're prone to bad. It means that in our emptiness, we're prone to figure out on our own how our willpower can get to the right thing, or to get to feel alive, or to get to somehow our willpower or knowledge can get us to God. The dilemma with legalism is it pushes us towards things that look good on the outside, as Jesus would say, a whitewashed tomb. Looks good on the outside, but filled with death. Life, on the other hand, the tree of life, fills us with life and then begins to transform from inside out, so that eventually the outside is changed as well.
Yeah. Let's see here. So I'm learning that praying for help really does produce a harvest of help from God. It's almost seamless.
Yeah.
And then what is the manner of making connection to God?
That's a great question. Let's take a minute to talk about that and then maybe wrap up. Because that'll actually transition us to where we go. With this as a foundation, then, what does this pathway to freedom look like starting here? One of the key practices of really finding the pathway to freedom is learning to hear God speak. That'll be where we begin next week. And one of the things we're going to tell you is we might take a moment next week to talk about the brain. But connection is an interesting thing. It's easier to experience than it is to actually describe. But connection is something that happens between two people when they're still enough to allow the barriers to fall down. Connection is a natural outcome. Right, we can go through our day and we've got tasks to do, and we've got to get to the office, we've got to get to the store, we got to get dinner. We get home and it's like, all right, I love you, and we kiss each other goodnight, and connection hasn't happened. Not because we are separate from each other, but because we're not connected. But in a moment of stillness, where there's an intentionality about letting the barriers fall.
Hi.
The natural result of letting the barriers fall and slowing down, connection is a natural thing in between people when it's safe to do and you allow the barriers to fall. Well, here's the thing. Sometimes the barriers are inside, and we'll say more about this next week. Just teach about the brain ever so briefly. But the limbic system, the kind of upper level of the brain, the limbic system is designed to help us experience connection. And what happens is the first disconnection is our disconnection with ourselves. We see it actually in the Genesis 3 story. But what happens is when we disconnect from self, we can go about our day, go about our business, go about our task simply from repetitive expectation and the pressure we put on ourselves to get things done. And you get home and you realize, I haven't taken a breath all day. If I haven't taken a breath and really been still and really taken a moment to go, where am I and what's happening with me? If I don't do that, then I stay disconnected from me. Listen carefully. we'll repeat this next week. If I stay disconnected from me, I can never connect to God.
Yeah.
So the first manner of connecting to God is to first of all stop and learn, what does it mean to connect to me? People say all the time, well, aren't we supposed to connect to God first? To which I would say this: if the lamp over here to my right is plugged into the wall, but it's snipped right at the lamp, it's connected to power, but it's not connected to itself. If I'm not connected to myself, I can't connect to anything else. So I can have God all around me, but I'm not letting him in because I've cut off my own heart. We'll talk about that in more detail.
Yeah.
Help us remember to talk about that next week. But so first and foremost, when you ask the manner of connecting to God, first and foremost is learning to connect to self. Secondly, then, is getting still, taking a couple deep breaths, and simply beginning to turn your awareness to his presence. In fact, why don't we end by doing that tonight? Wherever you are, even if you're watching this later, since the question was, what is this manner of connecting to God? One of the first things I would say is, after taking a moment to connect to self, recognize what's happening. I sure have been in a hurry today. I sure have been distracted today. Let me stop and be still and focus. And as I take that moment to connect to myself, the next thing is really just begin to be aware, or turn your awareness to the breath of God, the person of God, the Spirit of God all around you. See, connection and awareness are almost two sides of a coin. Because when awareness starts to cease, connection is ceasing at the same time. So as you turn your awareness to him, see if you feel things kind of settle down on the inside. And you're beginning to answer the question, what is the manner of connecting to God? It's a great question, by the way. Yeah. Now, if you would, just kind of in your mind, just ask him a question. First, maybe even in your mind, just acknowledge him.
Yeah. Hi, God.
Holly always starts her prayers like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that was in my mind when I said acknowledge him, the way you say that all the time. And as you acknowledge him, then just ask the question, what would you say to me tonight?
And the words will be kind and bring life here.
They'll feel like love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, gentleness, meekness, mercy, and self-control. If they feel like anything but that, then it's not God you're hearing. It could be the voice of an introject, which is a family member, that you still have their voice in your head.
Yeah,
it could be the voice, me? Oh, it could be the voice of another spiritual force. But if it's not love, joy, peace, etc., then it's not the Spirit of God. It's not the voice of God.
Just tell it to go away. Just say, no, you don't get to speak.
And then you turn your attention again.
And say, hi, God. You can even ask him, what is your favorite thing about me?
In the light of what we've said tonight, this thing that we're doing, this quick shift, or this shift to connect to God, really is fundamentally what the shift back from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil back to the tree of life, is really about turning your attention, and therefore your source, back to the breath of life, not what you know and how hard you should try. Listen, we've got a long ways to go on this journey together. But this last week and tonight are the key.
So this week, take some time, and if you hear that voice of like, you can do better, suck it up, be smarter, all of those things, remember that's not the voice of life. And take a deep breath, connect to self, and just let God connect. You connect to God, and then allow God to connect to you. And if you feel blocks, just pay attention to those and jot them down. It's like, what is that? What's blocking me? Am I trying too hard? Am I trying to think too hard? And do I just need to take some deep breaths and just sit in his presence? And if you didn't hear anything, you're not broken. You're not messed up. He just wants to sit with you. And sometimes just the peaceful silence is the words that you need to hear.
Very much. Often silence may not be simply nothing. Silence may be God saying, peace, be still.
Yeah.
And so don't mistake silence the way that you might have gotten silence from a cruel parent.
Yeah.
Silence of God is often him saying, I want to be still and I want to give you stillness. Yeah. And so listen, the key shift that happened in the garden was not about misbehavior and the future of punishment. The key shift that happened in the garden is that Adam and Eve's nature was changed because their source was changed. When they turned away from the breath of life, they became, instead of a living soul, they became a knowing soul. The knowledge of good and evil can't produce life. Jesus came to give life and life abundantly, not to ask you to try harder. So we will see you guys next week.
Love y'all and have a great night.
All right, bye.
Bye.